evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, and this is your mid-May 2026 Federal Crime Report. Tonight, a sweeping look across the Great Plains and Central Federal Districts of the United States, where prosecutors announce major convictions, guilty pleas, drug trafficking investigations, child exploitation cases, firearm prosecutions, immigration enforcement action, organized crime indictments, large-scale narcotic seizures stretching from Montana to Texas. Federal authorities say methamphetamine, fentanyl, cocaine trafficking, child exploitation crimes, cartel-like operations, financial fraud, and repeat illegal re-entry cases continue to overwhelm federal court dockets throughout the central United States. Tonight's report includes major developments from Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. We begin tonight in Montana. Federal prosecutors in Montana announced that 36-year-old Parker Lee Grayhawk of Poplar was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, after pleading guilty to wire fraud. Investigators say Grayhawk embezzled more than $150,000 from Fort Peck Manufacturing Incorporation through unauthorized company checks, altered payroll transactions, and personal purchases made using company credit cards. According to prosecutors, the scheme unveiled after the company discovered its bank account had fallen negative in balance due to suspicious transactions involving round-number checks and payroll irregularities. Investigators later uncovered unauthorized purchases involving Amazon, Apple, Cash App, PayPal, and Western Union transfers. Chief U.S. District Judge Brian Morse presided over the sentencing. Federal prosecutors also announced 56-year-old Timothy Harris of Washington State was sentenced to 5 years in prison after pleading guilty to conspiring to distribute fentanyl in Harbor and on Rocky Boys Indian Reservation. Investigators say Harvest coordinated fentanyl trafficking operations between Washington State and Montana during 2023. Controlled purchases documented multiple fentanyl sales arranged by Harris, including transactions occurring at hotels and reservation locations. During June of 2023 motel raid in Big Sandy, law enforcement seized approximately 3,200 fentanyl pills, along with a loaded 10mm handgun, ammunition, and cash. Federal authorities say the investigation highlighted the continued flow of fentanyl into tribal communities throughout the western United States. Meanwhile, in Billings, 55-year-old Derry Durrell Howard of Oregon was sentenced to more than 6 years in federal prison after authorities recovered large quantities of methamphetamine and fentanyl tied to trafficking operations. Investigators say officers stopped Howard's vehicle in January of 2023 after observing suspicious activity connected to narcotic distribution in downtown Billings. Police discovered methamphetamine and fentanyl in plain view inside the vehicle before later recovering additional narcotics, currency, and trafficking evidence from Howard's apartment. Federal prosecutors say officers ultimately seized 117 grams of methamphetamine and 153 grams of fentanyl during the investigation. Federal prosecutors also announced 50-year-old Truman Frank Jefferson Jr. pled guilty to attempting to coerce and entice involving a minor. Authorities say Jefferson sent sexually explicit messages, videos, and photographs to teenager victims over multiple years. Court documents allege Jefferson requested sex acts for victims while fully aware she was underage. Federal investigators recovered numerous electronic communications supporting the charges. Jefferson now faces a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison and could receive life sentence at sentencing later this year. In Minnesota federal court, 43-year-old Lenars Robert Roach was sentenced to more than 18 years in prison for cocaine trafficking and firearm offenses. Federal investigators documented multiple controlled cocaine purchases involving Roach before recovering additional cocaine, firearm, body armor, and trafficking material during a search connected to the case. Authorities ultimately seized nearly 1 kilogram of cocaine tied to trafficking operations. Federal prosecutors also sentenced 29-year-old Elise Heidi Geis of Chicago after investigators tied her to a nationwide prescription fraud scheme involving oxycodone and promethazine codeine. Authorities say members of the trafficking organization traveled from Montana using fraudulent prescriptions to obtain controlled substances from pharmacies before redistributing the narcotics. The investigation was conducted under the Homeland Security Task Force initiative targeting transnational criminal activity and drug trafficking networks. In a massive methamphetamine distribution conspiracy, federal prosecutors additionally announced 44-year-old Raymond Eugene Best Jr. pled guilty to possession of methamphetamine and cocaine with the intent to distribute. Investigators described Best as a major distributor operator throughout Billings with alleged cartel-linked supply routes stretching to Mexico. Authorities say Best coordinated distribution involving methamphetamine, fentanyl, and cocaine while previously serving federal supervised release from an earlier narcotics conviction. Federal investigators seized multiple pounds of methamphetamine through a lengthy investigation. Best faces a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years and up to life in federal prison. Moving to Wyoming, federal prosecutors announced 35-year-old Zachary Fosco of Chandler, Arizona, was sentenced to 67 months in prison for conspiring to distribute heroin and fentanyl throughout the United States Postal Services. Investigators intercepted a package containing 100 grams of fentanyl and more than 23 grams of heroin destined for Wyoming during a drug trafficking operation. Surveillance footage allegedly captured Fosco mailing the narcotic package from Arizona. Federal authorities say the investigation involved DEA, U.S. Postal Inspection Services, and Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation. Federal officials in Wyoming also announced restitution notifications are now being sent to victims connected to the connection of John Richmosh and Washoe Railroad construction. The case involved the failure restoration of the historic National Park Service's railcar project where workers and others allegedly exposed to asbestos without proper safety protections. A federal jury convicted the defendants in 2022 on wire fraud and knowingly endangerment charges. Victims are now being notified regarding medical testing compensation funds established from the court. In South Dakota, federal prosecutors announced that 27-year-old Bradley Two Eagle received a 30-month federal sentence after officers recovered ammunition while he was actively using methamphetamine. Authorities say Two Eagle fled from officers responding to a gunfire reports before discharging ammunition chase. Investigators also recovered methamphetamine syringe after the arrest. A federal jury convicted 24-year-old Emmanuel Simmons on charges involving sexual abuse without consent and sexual abuse of a minor following a trial in Rapid City. Prosecutors say the assault occurred in Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in July of 2024, involving a juvenile victim. Simmons now faces a possible life imprisonment. Federal juries also convict 23-year-old Kyle Beck on charges including attempted sexual exploitation of a minor, attempted enticement of a minor using the internet, and attempted receipt of child pornography. Investigators say Beck solicited explicit images from a 15-year-old girl through Instagram in 2023 before later admitting to the conduct. Federal prosecutors say the charges carry mandatory minimum prison sentence of 15 years. In Sussex Falls, Amanda Thomason has been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to methamphetamine trafficking and money laundering conspiracy charges. Authorities say Thompson coordinated repeat methamphetamine purchases from Omaha before redistributing narcotics in South Dakota. Investigators also traced money wire transfers connected to the individual in Mexico. In Colorado, federal prosecutors in Denver announced charges against Venezuelan national Jeremy Andres Boca Delfin and Wilmer Jose Blanco Sanchez involving alleged firearm trafficking operation. Authorities accused the men of selling firearms, obliterated serial numbers, high-capacity magazines, and narcotics known as Tutsi, a substance containing ketamine and MDMA. Investigators seized 12 firearms during the ongoing investigation. Federal authorities say the case also stretches into Tennessee and involves broader organized criminal activity. Federal prosecutors additionally secured the conviction of 43-year-old Nancy Morado Alvarez after a jury found her guilty on 37 counts involving false tax return preparation. Authorities say Alvarez fabricated business losses and fraudulently claimed pandemic-related tax credit for clients who were not eligible. Federal prosecutors estimate the scheme caused more than $150,000 in losses to the U.S. government. In Kansas, federal prosecutors announced Adeline Offner of Hyattsville was sentenced to 160 months in prison after pleading guilty to distributing child pornography. Her husband, Gavin Offner, separately pled guilty to receipt of child pornography and awaits sentencing. Investigators traced child sexual abuse material to the couple's residence after a cyber tip from the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. Authorities later recovered explicit images involving prepubescent minors from Gavin's Offner's cell phone. Federal prosecutors also announced 38-year-old Russell Scott IV of Alabama was sentenced to 6 years in prison after officers discovered approximately 3,000 fentanyl pills and 9 firearms during a traffic stop on Interstate 35 in Wichita. Authorities say the seizure prevented thousands of potential deadly fentanyl-laced pills from entering local communities. In Oklahoma, federal prosecutors announced former First National Bank of Lindsay president and CEO Danny Siebel pled guilty to bank fraud. Authorities accused Siebel of manipulating loan records, falsifying bank reports, and concealing non-performing loans involving friends and associates. The bank ultimately collapsed before federal regulators appointed the receiver in 2024. Siebel faces up to 30 years in prison. Federal prosecutors also announced that 45-year-old Darrington Everton Burns pled guilty to distributing and possessing child pornography. Authorities say Burns communicated with an undercover Homeland Security investigation agent on the dark web while discussing child exploitation and sharing explicit material. Burns now faces up to 40 years in federal prison. Federal authorities additionally charged an Oklahoma City man after investigators seized nearly 180 pounds of methamphetamine during a coordinated surveillance and traffic stop operation. Authorities say approximately 99 pounds were recovered from the vehicle, while an additional 80 pounds were recovered from the residence search. If convicted, all 3 defendants could face life imprisonment. In Texas, federal prosecutors announced extradition of alleged Tren de Agua leader Jose Acua Martinez Flores, also known as Chinquic. Authorities described Flores as a high-ranking leader tied to Venezuela criminal organization designed by the United States as a foreign terrorist organization. The indictment alleged Flores oversaw drug trafficking, extortion, prostitution, and murder operations in Colombia while coordinating cocaine shipments designed for the United States. If convicted, Flores faced life imprisonment. Federal prosecutors also announced a Nigerian national, Edkin Akpan, pled guilty to operating illegal money transmission businesses tied to business email comprised scams. Investigators say victims were tricked through spoof supplier emails into wire money to fraud accounts. One victim alone reportedly lost more than $927,000. Houston resident Raul Castro was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to armed robberies involving 2 grocery stores in Houston. Authorities say Castro banished firearms during the robberies and threatened store employees before later being identified through surveillance footage and evidence recovered from a stolen vehicle. Federal prosecutors additionally announced prison sentencing and convictions involving several separate child sexual abuse material investigations across Corpus Christi and Laredo. Authorities say investigations uncovered hundreds of explicit images and videos hidden on electronic devices. Several defendants now face decades in federal prison. The Southern District of Texas additionally announced more than 200 immigration and border-related criminal cases filed during a single week in May. Federal prosecutors say the case includes illegal re-entry offenses, human smuggling, firearm crimes, and repeat felony immigration violations connected to a broader border enforcement operation. In Louisiana, federal prosecutors announced charges against 27-year-old Honduran national Ezequiel Lara Reyes after authorities allegedly located him unlawfully presented in Topanga Parish. Federal prosecutors additionally announced guilty pleas and sentencing outcomes involving multiple methamphetamine and fentanyl trafficking cases throughout southeast Louisiana. Authorities say one defendant led officers on a high-speed pursuit before investigators recovered methamphetamine, fentanyl, and marijuana from his possession. Federal prosecutors also sentenced 43-year-old Ariel Cornico after she pled guilty to distributing so-called Animal Crush videos online. Authorities described the videos as depicting extreme acts of animal torture and violence involving monkeys. Federal officials called the material shockingly cruel and obscene. Federal prosecutors additionally sentenced Guatemalan national Jacob Arugo Uriels after authorities say he assaulted and bit an ICE officer during an immigration enforcement operation near Martree. Officers say Usriel later attempted to flee while still in handcuffs. Federal prosecutors also announced that Chinese national Zhang Zhang pled guilty in a marijuana trafficking conspiracy involving 100 kilograms of marijuana. Investigators traced the trafficking operation across Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi before recovering large quantities of narcotics, currency, and trafficking equipment. Federal prosecutors throughout the Great Plains and Central United States continue reporting escalating narcotic trafficking investigations, cartel link operations, online child exploitation crimes, organized fraud schemes, firearm trafficking, and immigration relation prosecutions. Authorities say fentanyl and methamphetamine distribution networks remain amongst the most significant threat facing federal law enforcement agencies nationwide. For continued coverage of federal criminal investigations, court proceedings, organized crimes, and nation public safety developments, stay with Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haley Ficuciello. Thank you for watching. Good night.